Ethiopia was the first Christian kingdom in the world.
Ethiopic or Ge'ez is one of the oldest languages, if not the oldest language we have in the world.
Researchers at Oxford University recently confirmed what Ethiopian monks have been guarding for 15 centuries. The oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence never left their mountain monastery. What those monks have been protecting, and what some of them were recently ordered to destroy, turns out to be something the rest of the Christian world was never meant to see. Deep inside a monastery carved into the cliffs of northern Ethiopia, a handful of monks made a decision. They had held a manuscript for generations. They had been told explicitly that it should never leave their walls. Some accounts suggest they were told to go further than that, to remove it from existence entirely. They didn't. Instead, they released it. And the page they released mentions Jesus by name. It describes him in ways that do not match anything in the Bible most of the world reads. And it raises a question that biblical scholars are still struggling to answer. Was this information suppressed on purpose, or did someone simply decide that the world wasn't ready? Sit with that for a moment, because the answer matters more than you might expect. That decision made centuries ago in the highlands of East Africa is now unraveling in real time. And the full story is far stranger, far older, and far more consequential than that single question suggests. To understand what's happening now, you need to understand where it's been hiding. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth. It traces its roots to the 4th century, when King Ezana of the ancient kingdom of Aksum converted to Christianity, guided by a Syrian missionary named Frumentius, making Aksum one of the first nations in human history to adopt the faith as a state religion. That was around 330 CE. The Roman Empire would not follow for another 50 years. Think about what that means. Ethiopia received Christianity so early, and its highland geography so effectively isolated it from the doctrinal disputes that reshaped the faith in Europe and the Middle East, that the Ethiopian church developed along its own entirely independent track. It made its own decisions about which texts were sacred. It translated those texts into Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that survives today only in liturgical use, the way Latin once functioned in the Catholic Church. And the canon the Ethiopian church settled on is unlike any other in all of Christianity. While the Protestant Bible contains 66 books and the Catholic Bible contains 73, the Ethiopian Orthodox canon contains 81, the largest biblical canon in all of traditional Christendom. More books, more history, more of the story. Those extra books are not fringe documents or marginal additions. They include the Book of Enoch, a text that describes fallen angels descending to earth and sharing forbidden knowledge with humanity. They include the Book of Jubilees, which rewrites the timeline of Genesis in ways that directly contradict the version most of the world uses. They include the Meshapha Kedan, the Book of the Covenant, which contains accounts of the resurrection and the post-resurrection teachings of Jesus that simply do not appear anywhere in Western scripture. Some of these texts were burned in Rome. Some were deliberately removed from circulation by councils and synods whose names most people have never heard. Ethiopia kept them, quietly, carefully, without announcement. And nobody outside those monasteries knew the full extent of what had been preserved. Now picture where this preservation happened. The Abba Garima Monastery sits on a cliff face in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, east of the city of Adwa, at an altitude where the air is thin and the stone is ancient. To reach it, you climb a winding path cut directly into the rock face, a path worn smooth by the feet of priests across 15 centuries. The walls of the monastery are thick and old enough to hold silence like a physical thing. Inside, the light falls in pale shafts through small windows. The smell is incense and dust, and something older than both, something that has no name in modern language because modern language was not built for spaces like this. The manuscripts are stored in leather cases stitched from thick brown hide, worn smooth by the hands of generations of priests who never imagined someone from the outside world would one day come to photograph what they held. The parchment inside is vellum-prepared animal skin, and some of it has gone brittle at the edges, curling slightly inward, as though it still wants to close, as though it knows it was never supposed to be opened by anyone beyond these walls. It was here, in the early 1950s, that a British art historian named Beatrice Plain became the first Westerner to document what the monks possessed. Because women are not permitted inside the monastery, the monks carried the manuscripts outside for her to examine. She wrote afterward that the illuminated heading struck her as Syrian in style, ancient, sophisticated, far older than anyone in the academic community had assumed. She had no idea what the radiocarbon tests would eventually prove. In the early 2000s, the Ethiopian Heritage Fund, a British charity established to protect Ethiopia's sacred objects, sent a team of specialists to the Abba Garima Monastery. Conservators Lester Capon and Mark van Stridonk made the climb in 2006 with equipment strapped to their backs, set up a workspace in the monastery courtyard, and began the careful, painstaking work of unbinding and stabilizing what are now known as the Garima Gospels. What they found stopped them. The manuscripts, 2 volumes, each containing roughly 400 pages of hand-copied text in Ge'ez, were not merely old. By the measurements of radiocarbon analysis conducted at Oxford University, they were potentially the oldest complete illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence. Oxford dated the parchment to somewhere between 330 and 650 CE. The previously acknowledged oldest illustrated Christian manuscript, the Rabula Gospels from Syria, dates to 586 CE. The Garima Gospels may be 2 centuries older than that, 2 centuries closer to the source. Judith Mackenzie of Oxford University and Francis Watson of Durham University later published a comprehensive scholarly study placing the manuscripts firmly within the late antique Mediterranean world, yet entirely and distinctively Ethiopian in character. But the analysis contained something even the monks found surprising. The text represented what scholars classified as an early Byzantine textual tradition, a version of the Gospels that predates the later revisions that shaped every Bible the Western world has ever read. Pause on that. The Garima Gospels may not just be old, they may be closer to the original text than anything the Western Church ever produced, before the councils, before the edits, before the decisions were made about what the world was and was not allowed to read. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the academic textbooks. But the monks weren't done. The Book of Enoch is one of the most consequential texts in religious history and one of the most deliberately disappeared. It is quoted directly and indirectly in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude references it almost verbatim. Early Christian writers, like Tertullian and Origen, treated it as authoritative scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1,947 inches, the caves above Qumran, contained fragments of it in Hebrew and Aramaic fragments that proved it had circulated widely in the world Jesus actually inhabited. But for centuries, the Western world believed the complete text had been lost, destroyed, gone. It had not been lost. It had never left Ethiopia. Ethiopian monks had preserved the Book of Enoch in its entirety in Ge'ez, copied and recopied by hand across centuries. Generation after generation of monks devoting their lives to the maintenance of a text that the rest of Christendom had been told no longer existed. It was the Scottish explorer James Bruce who brought 3 copies of the complete Ethiopian manuscript to Europe in 1773. And even then, most Western theologians dismissed it as a medieval fabrication, a fake, a fraud, a later invention dressed up in ancient clothing. It took the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove that the Ethiopian tradition had been protecting the genuine article all along. Think about the implication of that reversal. The institution dismissed it. The caves confirmed it. The monks had been right the entire time. The question that remains, the one that no official body has ever cleanly answered, is why the rest of Christianity abandoned it in the first place. The answer points directly to what makes this story genuinely uncomfortable. The Book of Enoch describes the Watcher's angels who descended to earth, taught humanity forbidden arts, and whose offspring became the source of violence and corruption in the world. It also describes the coming of a figure called the Son of Man, a divine judge who will arrive at the end of days. Early Christians understood this as a direct reference to Jesus. The language used to describe this figure was language the later church found dangerous. It suggested knowledge, power, and cosmic authority that existed before any institutional structure, before any hierarchy, before any church had been built to manage the relationship between the human and the divine. That is precisely where the problem lived. The Enoch tradition did not need a priest. It did not need an institution. It described a direct relationship between humanity and the divine that bypassed every structure the church was actively constructing. A faith that required no intermediary is a faith that requires no institution. And an institution cannot survive what it cannot make itself necessary for. To understand why that matters, we need to step back 17 centuries. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, just years after King Azana converted Ethiopia to Christianity, Roman Emperor Constantine convened bishops from across the empire to settle doctrinal disputes that were threatening to fracture the faith entirely. The question of which texts were authoritative was central to those deliberations. It was not a theological seminar. It was a political negotiation with eternal consequences. Over the following decades and centuries, texts that survived that process would define Christianity for over 1 billion people. Texts that did not survive would be lost or would survive only in the places where Rome's authority could not reach. Ethiopia was one of those places. There is a word the monks use for the texts they preserved, net. It means freedom. They were not hiding these texts. They were keeping them free. Now we arrive at the thing the title has been building toward, and I need you to stay with this carefully, because the details matter. The Mashafa Kidan, the Book of the Covenant, is one of the texts unique to the Ethiopian canon. It belongs to a category of writings called the Books of Church Order, 8 additional texts included in the Ethiopian New Testament that have no parallel anywhere in Western Christianity. The Mashafa Kidan contains, among other things, an account of the post-resurrection period, the weeks following the empty tomb, that goes further than any canonical gospel in describing what Jesus reportedly taught during that time. In the version preserved by Ethiopian monks, Jesus does not simply appear, bless his disciples, and ascend. He stays. He teaches. He addresses the questions that the canonical Gospels leave deliberately, conspicuously unanswered. He describes the nature of the divine. And then, according to the accounts of monks who spoke to independent scholars, beginning in late 2024, he warns explicitly about what will happen to his teachings once they pass through institutional hands. That warning is what made a specific page volatile enough that certain authorities reportedly wanted it removed from existence. The exact wording has not been released in any certified academic translation. What has been reported is that the passage contains a description of Jesus, cautioning his followers that his teachings would be narrowed, edited, and selectively preserved by those who came after. That the version of his words reaching future generations would be shaped not only by faith, but by power, not only by devotion, but by the requirements of the institutions built in his name. Now here is where the story divides, and I want you to decide which path feels more honest to you. The conventional explanation says this type of post-resurrection teaching narrative was common in early Christianity. There were dozens of such texts, many of them found among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1945 that described extended conversations between the risen Jesus and his disciples. Most were excluded from the canon not because they were uniquely dangerous, but because canon formation was a slow, uneven, and politically influenced process that produced inconsistent results across centuries. The Mashafa Kidan may simply represent a tradition that survived in one corner of the world while being forgotten everywhere else. Absence of malice. The ordinary chaos of history. The uncomfortable path says something different. It says the passage was ordered destroyed specifically because of that warning. Because an institution cannot easily survive a sacred text, suggesting that the institution itself, its authority, its hierarchy, its exclusive claim to mediate between the divine and the individual was anticipated and explicitly cautioned against by the very figure that institution claims to represent. One of those explanations is tidier. The other one keeps scholars awake at night. The monks kept the page. They always kept it. The story of what Ethiopian monks will protect and what they will risk to protect it became devastatingly concrete in November 2020, when war came to the Tigray region. The beginning of what would become one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century, a war that killed an estimated 600,000 people between 2020 and 2022, in a region that the international community took years to fully acknowledge. Father Gebre Kirstos Gebre Meskel, one of the resident monks at the Abba Garima Monastery, made a decision that echoed across 15 centuries of tradition. Under cover of darkness, he took the Garima Gospels out of the monastery for the first time in recorded history. He carried them in their leather cases down the monastery's winding stone steps and into the night. He hid them. He did not tell anyone where. 2 weeks later, Eritrean forces reached the monastery. They took what they could: mobile phones, livestock, grain stores, farming equipment. What they could not take, they destroyed. For the next 2 years, soldiers used Abba Garima as a military base. In the final days before a peace agreement was signed, 113 civilians were executed nearby by retreating forces. Their bodies were left where they fell. The Garima Gospels survived, hidden, waiting, as they had always waited. When Father Geber returned the manuscripts after the peace agreement was signed, he described the experience in terms that reach far beyond the military and political context. He said the texts had been hidden before, possibly for centuries, during previous invasions rediscovered later, sometimes by chance, sometimes by the careful memory of a single monk who knew where to look. He said the monastery had always understood that knowledge, to survive, sometimes has to disappear for a while. Let that land. Because if texts have been hidden and rediscovered before, if some of what Ethiopia preserved was already a second or third survival, then the question is no longer only what was saved. The question is, what was lost between the survivals? What pages did not make it through the last war? Or the one before that? Whether any of those lost pages contained something that would have changed everything about what the world believes? Whether we are reading a complete record or the surviving fragments of something far larger, and whether we will ever know the difference. Step back from the individual manuscripts for a moment and look at the larger shape of what this tradition represents in religious history. Every tradition that transmitted Christian texts made choices. Which texts were authoritative? Which descriptions of Jesus were theologically useful? Which version of the story the world would come to know? Those choices happened across centuries in councils and synods, in Nicaea, in Carthage, in Laodicea, mostly in the Roman world, mostly filtered through Roman political and cultural assumptions. The texts that survived that process tell a coherent story. They support a specific understanding of authority, salvation, and the relationship between the human and the divine. They were not selected randomly. They were selected. Ethiopia made different choices, and the texts that survived those different choices tell a more complicated story. Some scholars, including specialists in what is called the Second Temple Jewish tradition, the actual world that Jesus inhabited, argue that the Ethiopian canon preserves something genuinely older than what Rome produced. Not a fabrication, not a medieval invention. An earlier layer of Christianity, one in which the boundaries between the canonical and the apocryphal, between the accepted and the forbidden, had not yet been drawn. A version of the faith that existed before the lines were decided. They point to the Enoch tradition, to early Jewish Christianity, which understood the divine in ways that would later be formally declared heretical, to the sheer volume of material that Ethiopian monks preserved while the rest of the world was burning it. One theory, controversial, unverified, but impossible to entirely dismiss, suggests that the page the monks were ordered to destroy contains something even more specific. A description of Jesus explicitly critiquing the mechanism of religious authority itself, the priesthood. The concept of a human institution mediating between the divine and the individual. A direct, named critique of the very structure that would spend the next 2,000 years building its legitimacy on his words. If that reading is accurate, it places a deeply anti-institutional statement at the absolute heart of the world's most powerful institution. That is not just theologically awkward. That is existentially threatening to any organization that has spent 2 millennia claiming to represent Jesus accurately and completely. And yet the simpler explanation still exists. Canon formation was chaotic. Texts were excluded for inconsistent reasons across centuries. The monks may have preserved something genuinely ancient without it being part of any deliberate suppression. Both explanations can be true simultaneously. That is the nature of history at this distance. The Ethiopian texts are not secret in any practical sense. Scholars have known they existed for decades. The Book of Enoch was published in English translation in 1821. The Mashafa Kedan has been available in academic circles for years. But the specific page, the specific passage describing that warning remains untranslated in any peer-reviewed publication. The monks have not released the full text. No certified academic rendering exists. No institution has formally published it. And that restraint maintained after everything those monks risked to preserve it. After wars and invasions, and the weight of 15 centuries raises the question that keeps certain scholars genuinely uncomfortable. If it's not dangerous, why wait? Somewhere in northern Ethiopia, in a monastery that survived a war, the Garima Gospels have returned to their leather cases. The pages are still brittle, the ink is still legible, the gaze script flows across the vellum the way it has for 1,500 years, indifferent to everything that has happened around it. Indifferent to the councils and the conflicts, and the centuries of institutional decisions that shaped what the rest of the world calls Scripture. Those manuscripts have outlasted the kingdom that produced them. They outlasted medieval invasions, Italian colonizers, a devastating civil war. They were hidden in darkness and brought back into the light. They were carried down stone steps under cover of night and returned when the shooting stopped. They survived because a series of men, monks who gave their lives entirely to this specific task, who received no recognition and sought none, decided that the preservation of these texts mattered more than their own safety, that the weight was worth carrying, that the world would eventually be ready to receive what they had been given to protect. This is where the story becomes about something larger than manuscripts. We live in a period of profound institutional distrust, declining confidence in organized religion, mounting questions about what was selected and what was omitted, what was shaped by the people in power rather than the people those institutions were supposed to serve. Those questions are not new, but they are louder now than they have been in living memory. And into that environment, the Ethiopian tradition places an ancient, inconvenient idea that the original version of the story was bigger than what survived, that what most of the world calls the Bible is a selection, a preserved and protected selection, but a selection nonetheless, that somewhere in the highlands of a country the rest of the world spent centuries overlooking, monks were keeping something alive that others had been told to forget. The page they were ordered to destroy, the warning they were told to silence. They kept it. They always kept it. And now it is circulating partially, guardedly, a fragment at a time into a world that is perhaps finally ready to sit with what it says. Not because it destroys faith. The monks who preserved it are among the most devout Christians alive. Their faith is not diminished by what they carry. It is, if anything, deepened by the full weight of the story they know, but because it complicates faith in ways that make it more honest, more human, more like the actual, complicated, politically filtered, humanly imperfect story of what it means to encounter the divine across 15 centuries of history, survival, and hands that were not always clean. The text has weight. That weight has been carried faithfully across 15 centuries by people who believed the burden was worth bearing. Now it belongs to all of us. So here is where we are, and I want you to sit with this before you move on to something else. If the monks of Abba Garima were ordered to destroy a specific passage, a page describing Jesus warning his followers about what would happen to his teachings once power got hold of them, who gave that order? And when? Was it a recent instruction from within the Ethiopian Orthodox hierarchy itself, an institution that has its own reasons for carefully managing which parts of its canon become internationally visible, which texts circulate beyond the monastery walls, and which remain inside? Was the order older? A directive that traveled across centuries as an internal tradition, reminding each generation of monks that this particular passage was not meant for the world outside? Or is it possible that the monks were never ordered to destroy anything at all? That what they are releasing now is not a defiant act of resistance, not a violation of any instruction, but a deliberate and carefully timed disclosure, a decision made not under pressure, but with extraordinary patience. The deep, generational patience of people who believe that knowledge has weight and that you only release it when the one receiving it can bear to hold it. The monks say that some knowledge was preserved not by being announced, but by being hidden long enough that the wrong people stopped looking. Maybe that time is now. And maybe the most important question isn't what the page says. Maybe it's this. Are you ready to hear it?